I thought the hardest part of losing everything would be the moment it happened, but I was wrong. It was the silence after, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave, the kind that makes standing on the edge of a bridge at 2:17 in the morning feel like the most logical place in the world. The city below me blurred into streaks of white and red lights. Cars moving like they still had somewhere to go while I stood there with nowhere left at all, my fingers gripping the cold metal. Railings so tightly they burned, not from pain, just from the need to feel something real, anything real, because numbness is louder than screaming when it lasts too long. And I remember thinking that if I leaned forward just a little more, just enough to let gravity decide for me, then maybe the noise inside my head would finally stop. Maybe the weight of every bad decision, every wrong person, every door that had closed in my face would just disappear into the dark water below. I didn't even cry. Not anymore. I had run out of tears somewhere between losing my job that morning and finding my apartment door locked with my belongings sitting in a cardboard box like I was something that could be packed away and forgotten. I had called everyone I could think of, heard every version of "I'm sorry" that meant nothing, and somehow ended up here, staring down at a reflection of a life that didn't want me anymore. That's when I heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a voice behind me, calm, in a way that didn't belong to this kind of moment. If you're going to do something you can't take back, at least be honest about why. I froze, not because of the words, but because of how steady they were, like he wasn't afraid of me jumping, like he had already decided I wouldn't. I didn't turn around right away. I didn't want to see another stranger with pity in his eyes or worse, curiosity. But something about the way he stood there, quiet, patient, made it impossible to ignore him. So I glanced back over my shoulder, just enough to see him, tall, dressed in a dark coat that fit too perfectly to be ordinary, hands relaxed at his sides like he owned the night around us. His eyes met mine without hesitation, sharp, focused, like he was looking at a problem he intended to solve, not a girl about to fall apart. "Go away," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper carried by the wind. But he didn't move, didn't argue, didn't rush toward me like the movies would suggest. Instead, he took one step closer, slow, deliberate, as if every movement had been measured before he made it. "You don't want to disappear," he said, and I almost laughed. Because how could he possibly know that? How could anyone look at me right now and think I wanted anything other than an end to this feeling? "You don't know anything about me," I replied, tightening my grip on the railing. But he tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that felt unsettlingly precise. "I know enough," he said. "You're still here." And for a second, just a second, something inside me cracked. Not hope. Not yet. Just the smallest shift. Like maybe he was right. Like maybe standing here wasn't the same as wanting to fall. I hated that thought. Hated that he had planted it so easily. "Leave," I repeated, this time stronger. But instead of leaving, he slipped his hands into his coat pockets and looked out over the city beside me. Not too close. Not touching. Just there. Like he had decided we were sharing this moment whether I agreed or not. "My name is Alexander," he said after a beat. Like it mattered, like introducing himself at a time like this was somehow normal. I didn't respond, didn't care, but he continued anyway. "And whatever story you think ends here," he paused, glancing at me again, his voice lowering just enough to feel personal. "You're wrong." The wind picked up, brushing strands of hair across my face, and I realized my hands were shaking. Not from the cold, but from something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way he said it, like an absolute, like he had the authority to decide how things ended. "You don't get to decide that," I said, but it came out weaker than I intended, and his expression didn't change, not softer, not harder, just certain. "Actually," he replied, stepping just a little closer, close enough that I could feel his presence without him touching me. "I do." And that should have scared me. The confidence, the control in his voice. But instead it did something worse. It made me hesitate. And hesitation was dangerous when you were standing where I was. Because for the first time that night, I wasn't sure what I was about to do. And that uncertainty, that tiny fracture in my certainty, felt heavier than everything that had brought me here. "Get down," he said quietly. Not a command, not a plea, something in between, something that didn't leave room for argument. I swallowed, my throat dry, my mind racing through reasons to ignore him, to stay exactly where I was. But my body didn't listen. Not completely. My fingers loosened slightly on the railing, just enough to matter, just enough for him to notice. And when I finally stepped back, barely an inch, it felt like the world shifted under my feet. Like something irreversible had just happened, like I had made a choice I didn't fully understand yet. And as I stood there, no longer leaning forward, no longer ready to fall, I realized one terrifying truth. I hadn't saved myself. He had interrupted me. And somehow, that felt even more dangerous. I did not realize how loud the city was until I stepped away from the edge. Like every car horn and distant siren rushed back all at once, filling the space that had been quiet just seconds ago. And I hated it because the noise made everything real again, made me aware of the cold, the wind, the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still stuck in a life I did not know how to fix. I wrapped my arms around myself without thinking, trying to hold something together that already felt broken. And for a moment neither of us spoke. Alexander stood beside me like he had nowhere else to be. Like this bridge at 2 in the morning was exactly where he had planned to end up, which made no sense. Nothing about him made sense. Not the way he talked. Not the way he looked at me like I was not invisible. Not the way he had just decided I was not allowed to disappear. I turned slightly, enough to face him fully now. My eyes narrowing as I tried to understand what kind of man inserts himself into a stranger's worst moment without hesitation. "Do you do this often?" I asked, my voice steadier now, but still carrying the edges of everything I had been holding back. He glanced at me briefly before looking out over the water again. Like my question was not the important part of this situation. "No," he said simply, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant this was not random for him. It meant he had chosen to stop, chosen to speak, chosen me. "Then why?" I pushed, the words slipping out before I could stop it, and he paused. Just for a second, like he was considering how much to say, or maybe how much I deserved to hear. "Because you look like someone who still had a choice," he replied, and I almost laughed again, but it came out hollow. "You do not know anything about my choices," I said, shaking my head as I stepped another inch away from the railing, my body slowly remembering how to stand on solid ground. "I know what giving up looks like," he said, quietly, and this time when I looked at him, really looked, I saw something different beneath the control, not weakness, never that, but something older, something that had been there long before tonight, something that made his certainty feel less like arrogance and more like experience, and that unsettled me in a way I could not explain. "Well, congratulations," I muttered, turning away from the water completely now. "You stopped me. You said your piece. You can go." I expected him to leave. Then, expected the moment to end the way most things in my life did, abruptly and without meaning. But he did not move, not even a shift in his posture. "You do not have anywhere to go," he said, not as a question, not even as a guess, just a statement, and my chest tightened because he was right, because the truth was sitting there between us whether I wanted it to be or not. I hesitated, just long enough for him to notice. "And that was all it took. Come with me," he added, his tone unchanged. Calm, controlled, like he was offering something ordinary instead of something that could change everything. "No," I said immediately, the answer automatic, the idea ridiculous. "I am not getting into a car with a stranger at 2 in the morning." He exhaled softly, not annoyed, not amused, just patient, like he had expected that response from the beginning. "You already trusted me with more than that," he pointed out, and I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it. But the words caught in my throat because he was not entirely wrong. I had stood there, on that edge, with him behind me, within reach, and I had not jumped. I had listened, even if I did not want to admit it. "That is different," I said. Finally, my voice quieter now, less certain. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the difference without agreeing. "There is a car waiting," he said, gesturing subtly toward the far end of the bridge where I had not even noticed the dark vehicle parked under a flickering streetlight. It blended into the shadows so perfectly it might as well have been part of the night itself. "Of course there is," I murmured under my breath, a bitter edge slipping into my tone, because men like him did not walk, did not hesitate, did not exist without control over their surroundings, and suddenly everything about him made a little more sense and a lot less at the same time. "I am not asking you to trust me," he continued, his eyes returning to mine, steady and unyielding. "I am asking you to not go back to where you were heading. And that hit harder than I expected, because where I had been heading was nowhere, less than nowhere, a place I could not come back from. I looked past him at the car, then back at the empty stretch of sidewalk behind me, the direction I had come from, the direction that held nothing but closed doors and unanswered calls, my options laid out in front of me in a way that felt almost cruel. And for a long second, I just stood there, caught between two choices I did not want to make. "You do not even know my name," I said, grasping for something, anything to ground this moment in reality. He held my gaze without blinking. "Emily," he replied, and my breath caught. Sharp and sudden, my heart stuttering in my chest as a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. "How?" I started, but he shook his head slightly, cutting me off before I could finish. "That is not the question you should be asking," he said. And there it was again, that certainty, that quiet authority that made everything feel like it was already decided, like the path in front of me had shifted the moment he spoke my name. And I realized, standing there under the dim light with the city moving on around us, that walking away might not be as simple as I wanted it to be, because something about him, about this moment, had already started to rewrite the direction I thought my life was going, and I was not sure I had the strength to pretend it had not. I should have walked away the moment he said my name. That should have been the line I refused to cross, but instead I stood there frozen, my mind racing through every possible explanation that did not make sense. I had not told him, I had not shown him anything, and yet he said it like it belonged to him, like he had known it long before tonight. "You have been following me," I said, the accusation slipping out before I could soften it, my voice sharper now, defensive, trying to rebuild a wall that had already cracked. But Alexander did not react the way most people would. No denial, no frustration, just that same steady gaze that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. "If I had been following you," he said calmly, "you would not have ended up here alone." And that answer did not comfort me. It made something deeper settle into my chest, something that felt dangerously close to trust. And I hated that feeling more than anything, because trust had been the reason I lost everything in the first place. "That is not reassuring," I replied, crossing my arms tightly as if that could keep him out, keep whatever influence he had from getting any closer. He glanced at the car again, then back at me, measuring something I could not see. "You are cold," he said simply, and I almost snapped back that I was fine, that I did not need him pointing out the obvious. But the truth was my hands were still shaking. My jacket was too thin for the wind cutting across the bridge, and exhaustion had started to creep back in now. That the adrenaline was fading. "I will be fine," I said anyway, because pride was easier than admitting I had nothing left. He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded once, like he had accepted my answer even though we both knew it was not true. "Then walk away," he said, stepping back half a pace, giving me space, giving me exactly what I had asked for. And that was the moment everything shifted, because suddenly the choice was mine again. There was no pressure, no command, no hand reaching out to pull me in one direction or the other, just silence and the open path behind me. I turned slightly, looking down the empty sidewalk, imagining myself walking back into a city that had already closed its doors on me, imagining finding somewhere to sit until morning, somewhere to exist without being noticed, and for a second I almost did it, almost took that step, but then I looked back at him, still standing there, still watching, not with expectation, but with certainty, like he already knew what I would decide, and something about that certainty made my chest tighten. "Why do you care?" I asked quietly, the question heavier now, less defensive, more real, because that was the part one could not understand. People did not care without a reason, not anymore, not in my world. His expression did not change, but there was a pause this time, a fraction of a second where it felt like he was choosing his words carefully. "Because you were about to disappear," he said, "and I do not ignore things that matter." I blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of it, the way he said it like it was obvious, like I should understand, but I did not. I could not. "I do not matter," I said, the words automatic, something I had been telling myself for so long they felt like fact. But his eyes sharpened slightly, a subtle shift that carried more weight than any raised voice. "That is where you are wrong," he replied, and the conviction in his tone sent a strange ripple through me. Not comfort, not yet, but something that made me hesitate again. My gaze drifted back to the car, to the dark shape waiting under the streetlight, and I realized I had run out of arguments, run out of reasons to say no that actually held up against the reality in front of me. I had nowhere to go, nothing to return to, and for the first time that night, the idea of stepping into something unknown felt less terrifying than staying exactly where I was. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders dropping slightly as the tension eased just enough for me to move. One step, then another, not toward him, not yet, just away from the edge, away from the place that had almost become my ending, and when I finally stopped, I was closer to him than before, close enough to feel the warmth that cut through the cold air, close enough to realize that whatever this was, it was already happening. "This does not mean I trust you," I said, meeting his eyes with what little strength I had left, and for the first time, something like the hint of a reaction crossed his face, not a smile, not quite, but something softer, something that made him look less like a stranger and more like a man who had expected exactly that answer. "It means you made a better choice," he said, and without waiting for anything else, he turned and started toward the car, not checking if I would follow, not needing to. And that was the part that unsettled me the most, because as I stood there watching him walk away with that quiet confidence, I realized he was not hoping I would come with him. He was certain I would, and after everything that had happened tonight, after everything I had lost, I hated how right that certainty felt as I took my first step after him. The car looked even more out of place up close, like it did not belong to the same world I did, sleek and dark with windows tinted just enough to hide whatever was inside. And for a second I stopped a few feet away, my instincts catching up to what my feet had already decided. This was the moment I could still turn back, still pretend none of this had happened. But Alexander reached the passenger side before I could say anything, opening the door with a smooth, effortless motion like he had done it 1,000 times, like this was routine for him. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," he said, his voice quieter now, less commanding but no less certain. "Just get out of the cold." I hesitated, my eyes flicking between him and the open door, the warm light inside spilling onto the pavement like an invitation I did not trust. "And then what?" I asked, because I needed something concrete, something that felt like control, even if it was just an answer. He held my gaze for a moment, then shrugged slightly, a small movement that somehow felt more honest than everything else he had said so far. "Then, you rest," he replied, "and tomorrow you decide what comes next." I studied him carefully, searching for the catch, for the part where this turned into something I would regret. But there was nothing obvious, no pressure, no hidden urgency, just patience. And that was what finally broke whatever resistance I had left, because people who wanted something from you did not wait. They pushed, they insisted, they took, but he just stood there, holding the door open like he already knew the outcome. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding and stepped forward, the movement small but heavy, like crossing an invisible line I could not step back over. The warmth inside the car wrapped around me immediately, soft leather seats, a faint scent of something clean and expensive, nothing overwhelming, just controlled, like everything else about him. I slid into the seat slowly, my body tense despite the comfort. And the moment I did, the door closed with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten again. Alexander walked around the front of the car without a word, his footsteps steady, unhurried, and when he got in beside me, the driver in the front seat nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that confirmed what I had already started to suspect. This was not normal. None of this was normal. The engine started smoothly, barely a sound, and as the car pulled away from the curb, I felt something shift inside me, like the bridge was already too far behind to matter. I stared out the window as the city lights passed by in blurred streaks, trying to ground myself in something familiar, but everything felt different now, distant, like I was watching my own life from the outside. "Where are we going?" I asked after a moment, my voice quieter than before, less sharp, more uncertain. Alexander leaned back slightly in his seat, one arm resting casually as if this was just another drive through the city, somewhere safe, he answered. And I almost laughed at that, because safe was not a word I trusted anymore, not after everything that had led me here. "You keep saying things like that," I muttered, glancing at him briefly, "like they are supposed to mean something." He turned his head just enough to meet my eyes, and there it was again, that intensity, that focus that made it hard to look away. "They do," he said simply, and I swallowed, looking back out the window quickly, because holding his gaze felt like giving him something I was not ready to give. Silence settled between us again, but it was different now. Not heavy, not suffocating, just there, like a space neither of us felt the need to fill. And as the car moved deeper into parts of the city I did not recognize, quieter streets, cleaner, more controlled, I realized something that sent a quiet unease through me. I had no idea where I was going. No plan, no backup, nothing to hold on to except the presence of a man I had met less than an hour ago. And yet I had not asked him to stop, had not reached for the door, had not even considered it seriously, because something about the way he moved through the world, the way he spoke, the way he had looked at me on that bridge, made it feel like this was not just a ride, not just a temporary escape. It felt like the beginning of something I did not understand yet, something I had not agreed to but had already stepped into. And as the city lights faded behind us and the road ahead grew quieter, I realized the most unsettling part was not that I had gotten into the car, it was that a part of me was relieved I did. I did not realize how far we had gone until the city sounds disappeared completely, replaced by a kind of quiet that felt intentional, like even the noise had been filtered out before it could reach us. The car slowed as we turned onto a long driveway lined with tall trees that blocked out the rest of the world, and for a moment I felt something tighten in my chest again, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that tells you there is no easy way back once you step any further. I glanced at Alexander, searching for something in his expression, some sign that this was too much, too fast, but he looked the same as before, composed, unreadable, like every step of this night had already been decided long before I ever stood on that bridge. The car came to a smooth stop in front of a house that did not look like a house so much as something carefully designed to impress without trying. Large windows glowing softly from inside. Clean lines, nothing excessive but nothing lacking either. It felt controlled. Like him, the driver stepped out first, opening my door before I could even reach for the handle, and I hesitated again, my hand hovering in the air as I looked from the open door to Alexander. "You said I could decide tomorrow," I reminded him, quietly, needing to hear it again, needing to know I had not imagined that part. He met my eyes without hesitation. "You can," he said, no hesitation, no condition attached, and that should have made it easier, but it did something else instead. It made me step out of the car, because if I still had a choice, then staying did not feel like being trapped. It felt like choosing to see what came next. The air outside was colder here, sharper, and I wrapped my arms around myself again as I followed him toward the entrance. The door opened before we reached it, not by him, but by someone inside. Another man, dressed as precisely as the driver, who stepped aside without a word, his presence quiet but unmistakably alert. I slowed for a fraction of a second, my instincts picking up on the difference. This was not just a house. This was a place that functioned with structure, with awareness, with people who moved like they had a purpose beyond simple routine. "You live here," I said, not really a question, just stating the obvious as I stepped inside. The warmth hit me immediately, along with a sense of space that felt almost unreal compared to everything I had left behind earlier that night. Alexander did not answer right away, walking ahead just enough to lead without forcing me to follow. "Sometimes," he said finally, and that single word told me more than a full explanation would have. This was not the only place, not the only life he had access to, and for the first time, the full weight of who he might be started to settle in. I paused just inside the doorway, taking in the details without meaning to. Everything was precise, intentional, nothing out of place, like the entire environment had been curated to reflect control, power without needing to show it. "You are not what I expected," I admitted before I could stop myself, and he glanced back at me, one eyebrow lifting slightly, not offended, not curious, just acknowledging the statement. "You did not expect me at all," he replied, and that was true, painfully true, because nothing about tonight had been expected, planned, or understood. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders lowering just slightly as the exhaustion returned, heavier now that I was no longer fighting to stay upright on that bridge. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter, less guarded, not because I trusted him, but because I did not have the energy to keep pretending I was in control of this situation. He studied me for a moment, his gaze moving over me not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt like he was assessing something important, something I could not see. "Now you rest," he said, repeating his earlier promise. But this time it sounded less like a suggestion and more like something that would happen regardless. He gestured toward the hallway, and almost immediately, the man who had opened the door stepped forward slightly. "Ready? Waiting? He will show you where to go," Alexander added, already turning away as if the decision had been made, as if my part in this moment was finished, and that should have bothered me. The way he moved on so easily, the way he assumed I would follow instructions from a stranger in a house I did not know. But instead I stood there for a second longer, watching him walk away without looking back, and realized something that unsettled me more than anything else that had happened tonight. I was not being forced into anything. Not really. Every step I had taken had been mine. Every choice had been mine. And somehow, that made this situation feel far more real, far more binding, because it meant I could not blame anyone else for what came next. I turned slowly toward the man waiting beside me, his posture calm, respectful, but firm in a way that suggested this was not optional in the way it might seem. And after a brief hesitation, I nodded once, more to myself, then to him, and followed, because for better or worse, I had already stepped into a world that did not feel temporary. And something deep down told me this was not just a place to rest. It was the beginning of something I would not be able to walk away from as easily as I had walked away from that bridge. I expected the room to feel unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable, but the moment I stepped inside, something about it made me pause, not because it was extravagant, but because it was quiet in a way I had not experienced in a long time. The kind of quiet that does not come from emptiness, but from control. Everything in its place, soft lighting, clean lines, a bed that looked untouched, like it had been waiting without knowing who for. The man who led me there stopped just inside the doorway, giving a slight nod as if his role ended the moment I crossed the threshold. "If you need anything, someone will be outside," he said, his tone respectful but distant. And then he stepped away, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone for the first time since the bridge. And suddenly the silence felt different, heavier, because now there was nothing pulling my attention away from everything I had been avoiding. I stood there for a moment, not moving, just listening to my own breathing as it slowly evened out, my body finally catching up to the exhaustion I had been running from. I walked further into the room cautiously, like I was afraid something might change if I moved too quickly, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of a table, the fabric of the curtains, grounding myself in something physical, something real, because everything else about tonight still felt unreal. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror across the room and almost did not recognize the person staring back at me, my hair damp from the mist on the bridge, my eyes tired, hollow in a way that made it clear how close I had come to disappearing. And for a second, that image made my chest tighten again, not with panic, but with something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. I looked away quickly, moving toward the bed instead, sitting down slowly as if I expected it to vanish beneath me. But it did not. It held steady, solid, and that simple fact felt strangely reassuring. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands covering my face as I tried to sort through everything that had happened in the last hour. The bridge, Alexander, the car, this place. None of it fit together in a way that made sense, and yet it had all happened. It was still happening, and I was here, in a room that was not mine, in a life that had shifted without warning. "You can still leave," I whispered to myself, the words sounding weaker out loud than they had in my head, because the truth was I did not know where I would go if I did. I had nothing waiting for me outside these walls, no safety, no plan, just the same emptiness that had led me to that edge. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping as the tension eased just enough for me to feel how tired I really was, not just physically, but in a way that ran deeper, a kind of exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together for too long without anything to support you. I lay back carefully, staring up at the ceiling, expecting my mind to keep racing, to refuse to rest, but instead, the stillness of the room began to settle over me, quieting the noise in a way I had not thought possible. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I did not feel like I had to fight anything, not my thoughts, not my past, not even the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring, because for now, There was nothing demanding anything from me. No expectations, no pressure, just a pause. A moment that existed outside of everything else. My eyes grew heavier despite myself, my body giving in to the exhaustion I had been ignoring, and just before sleep pulled me under, one thought surfaced, clear and sharp in a way that cut through everything else. This was not random. None of it was. Alexander had not just appeared, had not just decided. There was something more here, something I did not understand yet. And as that realization settled in, I felt a strange mix of unease and relief, because whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into tonight, it was no longer just about surviving. It was about something else entirely, something that was already beginning to change the direction of my life in ways I was only starting to feel. I woke up slowly, not because I wanted to, but because something felt different, the kind of difference your body notices before your mind catches up. The room was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. No distant traffic, no voices through thin walls, no pressure of time pushing me out of bed, just stillness, controlled and intentional. And for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember where I was, trying to piece together the fragments of the night before, the bridge, the cold air, Alexander's voice, the car, the house. It all came back in pieces, not overwhelming, just present, like something I could not ignore anymore. I pushed myself up slowly, the blanket falling away as I sat on the edge of the bed, my body still heavy with sleep, but my mind sharper than it had been in days, maybe weeks, and that alone felt strange, like I had stepped into a version of myself that had been waiting for something to shift. I stood carefully, my bare feet touching the floor as I moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to let the morning light in, soft and steady, revealing a view that did not belong to my life. Trees, distance, privacy, no signs of the chaos I had left behind. And for a second, I just stood there, letting that reality settle in. This was not temporary, not in the way I had first told myself. Something about this place, about him, suggested permanence, even if I had not agreed to it yet. A quiet knock at the door pulled me back, not loud, not demanding, just enough to remind me I was not alone. I hesitated before answering, my instincts catching up again, but then I moved, opening it slowly to find the same man from the night before standing there, composed as ever. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said, his tone polite but distant, and hearing my name again sent a small ripple through me, a reminder that nothing here was accidental. "Mr. Kane asked me to let you know breakfast is ready whenever you are," he continued, stepping back slightly to give me space. I nodded automatically, not trusting my voice yet, and closed the door again, leaning against it for a second as I processed what that meant. Breakfast, like this was normal, like I had not almost ended everything just hours ago, like I belonged here in some way I could not explain. I changed quickly, using what I found in the room without questioning where it came from. Everything fit too well, like it had been chosen with intention, and that thought made me pause, but not enough to stop, because part of me already understood that questioning every detail would not change the situation. It would only delay whatever came next. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, following the direction I had been shown the night before, my footsteps quiet against the polished floor as I moved deeper into a space that felt both open and controlled. And then I saw him, sitting at the table like he had been there the entire time, calm, composed, a cup of coffee in front of him, his attention shifting to me the moment I entered. Not surprised, not curious, just aware. "You slept," he said, not as a question, and I nodded slightly, stopping a few feet away, unsure of where exactly I stood in this space. In this situation, I did. I replied, my voice steady but cautious, and he gestured to the chair across from him. A simple motion that carried the same quiet authority as everything else he did. "Sit," he said, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before doing it, because despite everything, despite the uncertainty, there was something about the way he spoke that made resistance feel unnecessary, or maybe just pointless. I sat down slowly, my eyes flicking briefly to the table, the food already there, untouched, waiting, and I realized then that this was not about hospitality. Not really. This was about control, about creating a space where I had no immediate reason to leave, no reason to run. "You said I could decide today," I said, meeting his eyes directly. Needing to establish that one thing before anything else, he held my gaze without hesitation, a slight nod confirming it. "You can," he replied, just as simply as before, and for a moment, silence settled between us again. But it was different now, heavier with expectation, not from him, but from me, because now I had to figure out what that decision actually meant, what I was choosing between. And as I sat there across from a man who had already changed the direction of my life without asking, I realized something that made my chest tighten again. Leaving would be simple in theory. I could stand up, walk out, return to whatever was left of my old life. But staying meant stepping into something unknown, something controlled, something that felt bigger than just a place to sleep or a meal at a table. And the most unsettling part was not that he was offering it. It was that a part of me was already considering accepting it, not because I trusted him, but because for the first time in a long time, I was not completely lost, and that feeling, as fragile as it was, made the idea of walking away far more difficult than I had expected. I should have said no right then, should have pushed the chair back, stood up, and walked out before whatever this was went any further. But instead I stayed where I was, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, my eyes locked on his as I tried to understand something that refused to explain itself. "What exactly am I deciding?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying a weight I could not hide. Because this was no longer about a place to sleep or a meal in front of me. This was about something deeper, something that had already begun to change the direction of my life without my permission. Alexander did not answer immediately. He reached for his coffee instead, taking a slow sip like time was something he controlled just as easily as everything else around him. And that pause, that deliberate lack of urgency, made my chest tighten slightly, because it told me this conversation mattered more than he was letting on. "You are deciding whether you return to a life that led you to that bridge," he said finally, setting the cup down with quiet precision, "or whether you step into something different." I let out a small breath, shaking my head slightly as I leaned back just enough to create space. "Between us, that is not really a choice," I said, because going back meant returning to nothing, to loss, to emptiness that had already proven it could break me. And he watched me carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting me reach that conclusion on my own. "No," he agreed. "It is not." And something about the way he said it made it clear he already knew exactly what I would say next, exactly how this would unfold. And I hated that certainty even as I felt myself leaning into it. "So what is the catch?" I asked, because there had to be one. There always was. Nothing this controlled, this intentional, existed without a reason behind it. His expression did not change, but there was a shift in his posture, subtle but present, like he was acknowledging the question as the right one. "There is no catch," he said, and I almost laughed again. But this time I stopped myself, because the look in his eyes told me he was not lying, at least not in the way I expected. "There is always something," I replied, my fingers tightening slightly against the table as I held his gaze, refusing to let him deflect. And for the first time since I had met him, he leaned forward just slightly, closing the distance between us by inches that somehow felt like more. "There is a condition," he said quietly. And there it was, the part one had been waiting for, the part that made this make sense again. "I want you to stay," he continued, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that I could not fully read, not demand, not quite a request, something in between that made it harder to categorize. I blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of it, because I had expected something more complicated, something that would immediately make me pull away. But this was just a statement. "Stay." I repeated, the word feeling heavier than it should, because it was not just about a house or a room. It was about stepping into his world, into whatever this was that he had built so carefully around himself. "For how long?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more measured, because the answer to that question mattered more than anything else. He studied me for a moment, his eyes steady, unwavering, like he had already decided this part too. "Until you no longer need to leave," he said, and something about that answer unsettled me more than anything else he had said so far, because it was not a time frame, not a limit. It was open, undefined, and that made it feel permanent in a way I was not ready to accept. I looked away for a second, my gaze dropping to the table as I tried to process what he was offering or asking, or deciding, because it felt like all three at once. "And if I say no," I said finally, forcing the words out even though part of me already knew the answer. He did not hesitate, not even for a second. "Then you leave," he replied, just as simply as before. No resistance, no argument, no attempt to change my mind. And that should have made the decision easier. But instead it made it harder, because it meant this was real, the choice was real, and whatever I decided would be mine alone. I looked back at him slowly, searching his face for any sign that this was a test, a manipulation, something I could push against. But there was nothing, just that same quiet certainty, that same control that made everything feel inevitable. And I realized then that this was not about convincing me. It was about giving me a direction and waiting for me to step into it on my own. My heart beat a little faster as the weight of that understanding settled in. Because staying did not just mean accepting help, it meant accepting him, his world, his presence in my life in a way I could not undo easily. And leaving meant going back to a version of myself that had already decided it was not enough to keep going. I swallowed. Slowly, the silence stretching between us as I stood on another kind of edge, not physical this time, but just as real. And for a long moment I did not move, did not speak, because I knew whatever I said next would change everything again, just like stepping back from that railing had. And this time, there would be no pretending it was temporary, no telling myself I could walk away unchanged, because deep down, I already understood something I had been trying not to admit. He had not just interrupted my ending. He had started rewriting it, and now he was waiting to see if I would let him continue. I felt the answer before I said it, not as a clear decision, not as something I had carefully thought through, but as a quiet shift somewhere deeper. The same kind of shift that had made me step back from the edge. The same kind of moment where hesitation became something else, something that moved me forward without asking permission. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the way he held himself, at the calm certainty that had not wavered since the moment he spoke to me on that bridge. And I realized something I had been avoiding. He was not trying to convince me because he did not need to. He had already changed the direction I was going, and now he was simply waiting to see if I would accept it. "This is not normal," I said quietly, my voice steady but honest, because I needed him to understand that I saw it, the control, the structure, the way everything around him moved with purpose. He nodded slightly, not denying it, not softening it. "No," he agreed, and that single word carried more truth than anything else he could have said. I exhaled slowly, my fingers loosening against the edge of the table as I leaned back just enough to create space to think. But the truth was I had already thought about it. Every angle, every possible outcome, and none of them led to something better than what I had left behind. "If I stay," I said, choosing my words carefully, because this mattered more than anything I had said so far. "It is not because I need saving." His eyes held mine, steady, focused, and for the first time, there was something there that felt almost like acknowledgement, not of my weakness, but of my strength. "I know," he replied, and that was it. No argument, no correction, just acceptance. And that was the moment everything settled. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough for me to move forward. I nodded once, a small movement that felt heavier than it should. "Then I stay," I said, the words simple, direct, but carrying a weight that I could feel all the way down to my chest. Because this was not just a temporary decision, this was not just about today. It was about stepping into something that would shape everything that came next. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the understanding of what I had just agreed to, what I had just allowed, and Alexander did not react the way I expected. There was no visible relief, no shift in his posture, just a slight change in his gaze, something that felt quieter, deeper, like he had anticipated this outcome all along. "Good," he said, simply, and for some reason, that word did not feel dismissive. It felt final, like a door closing behind me, and another opening ahead. I looked down at the table for a second, at the untouched food, at the space between us that no longer felt uncertain in the same way, and I realized something that both grounded me and unsettled me at the same time. I had chosen this. No one had forced me. No one had pressured me. I had looked at what was behind me and what was in front of me and decided to step forward, and that meant whatever came next was mine to face, not something I could run from or blame on circumstance. What happens now? I asked quietly, not out of fear, but out of the need to understand the next step. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but still controlled, like every movement had intention behind it. Now, he said, his voice calm, steady. You live. And that word hit differently than I expected, because living had not felt like an option before. It had felt like something I was failing at, something I was barely holding on to. But now, sitting here in a place that did not belong to my past, with a man who had stepped into my life without warning and refused to let me disappear, it felt like something else entirely, something that might actually mean more than just getting through the day. I nodded slowly, letting that idea settle in, not fully understanding it yet, but willing to explore it, because for the first time in a long time, I was not standing on the edge of an ending. I was standing at the beginning of something uncertain, controlled, and undeniably real. And as I met his gaze one more time, I understood one final truth that stayed with me long after that moment passed. He had not saved me. He had not fixed me. He had simply given me a different direction, and I had chosen to follow it, not because I was lost, but because for the first time, I believed there might actually be somewhere worth going.